Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Wiebrecht here. I wanted to thank all of you for getting me your documentation for the quarterly quiz along with the writing assignment. I'm hoping you guys can see that, the grades in Google Classroom. If you cannot, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and try to sync some things so you guys can see it in the bright space end of it, but everything is posted in Google Classroom, so please let me know if you cannot see that. All right, we're going to move forward with our final chapter, race and ethnicity. This is a really interesting chapter because it begins to, I think, talk to us again about that nature versus nurture controversy. And we talk about sometimes a system of inequality based off the concept of race. And race is something that I think permeates through every institution that we're going to talk about, every relationship, and every individual in the United States. So it's really a conversation that I think needs to be had because we're going to dispel some of the myths. We're going to give you a little bit of education on what the reality is that we're talking about. Race is different. It's not necessarily better or worse. It's just that we've had millions of years of adaptation to climate and interbreeding that's created the world that we see around us. Everybody looks different. And so that's so important for us to understand what race truly is so that you guys have that stronger educational component as well as that sociological foundation. Okay? All right. So what is race? Let's first talk about skin color. Right? I think a lot of times people automatically assume that race is associated to skin color. I want you guys to understand that skin color is biological, right? That's a physical characteristic of somebody. There is a line between physical and social that oftentimes gets misconstrued. We hear those rumors like, are blacks better athletes due to having certain thigh bones? Or because they're socialized to see sports as an opportunity for upward mobility, right? But what we don't understand is that when we look at skin color, that doesn't necessarily constitute race. Race is a category of people who has certain physical characteristics to distinguish it from other groups, right? So these physical characteristics, we're talking about skin color, hair texture, eye shape. We know that there are certain social references to certain types of groups, right? Whether it's African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, right? We have seen cultural adaptations from those backgrounds. Native Americans are another group. This is the idea of race, not physical differentiation, right? So when we historically look at things, we know in the 19th century, some biologists sort of divided the world into three racial categories, right? They believed that there were three different types, and that was it. Look at where we are today with the various different groups of individuals that exist within our society. We have, of course, you guys are probably very familiar with groups in which there were issues with people having not being a pure race. Let me say that, right? And so we hear of things such as the Holocaust and those types of things where race became such a huge controversy within this because we begin to see that it separated one group from another, one person from another. Those human characteristics, that skin color, that hair texture, maybe that nose shape or that eye color, whatever the case is, right? It became people began to look at it a different lens, right? So we began to see that we have this mapping system of the human genome system that looks at these so-called racial groups and seeing how we sort of look from one to another and things. But what we see in the human race is that we are so remarkably diverse nowadays. We look at images of this where we have individuals from different groups that it is just remarkable to see how we have evolved over time, right? And so we're going to begin to dissect this a little bit more for you guys. Understand that in racial differences, they're based off of that phenotypical differences, like that skin color doesn't necessarily correlate with genotypical differences. So what do I mean by this? Genotypical differences are those that are differences in the genetic makeup. Not only are there enormous genetic similarities among certain races, but interbreeding over centuries have often further mingled that biological characteristics, okay? So I think people get confused. So remember that race is something that we need to associate with those physical characteristics. That's the race that we see. We have somehow, as a society, indicated, oh, that person looks this way, or they have this skin color, or hair type, or eye shape, or whatever the case is. That means they're part of this particular race. Okay? Ethnicity is something that I think that we need to sort of keep in mind here. Ethnicity refers to a collection of people who are sort of distinguished or who distinguish themselves by a shared culture or nationality characteristics, okay, which we'll dive a little bit more into here. But understand that anthropologists, biologists, and even sociologists have looked at how people have begun to divide different groups into certain races. And we're sort of stuck on that term. This is something that we as humans have created, this concept of race. And so people tend to see race as certain races maybe perhaps being superior than others, and others being maybe inferior. So we know that no race is better than another. All races have this, their own very unique sense of who they are. But that is a myth that has existed for so long within our societies that there is certain racial superiority. And so that myth is very dangerous when we begin to look at it. We look historically at things like with Adolf Hitler, like I had talked about, where they believed that Aryans were a superior race. And in order to establish an advanced culture and a new world order, that they needed to rid the world and destroy races that threaten that racial purity and that particular culture. You and I now know that is absurd and one of the most devastating events within our societies. But we begin to look at how Hitler had these views and left that appalling legacy, in a sense, with the slaughter of groups that he saw as inferior: Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, and people with mental and physical disabilities, right? So we've seen horrific images from that time period. I'm sure you guys have talked about that in maybe history or some other courses that you've taken. What I think is something that is overlooked a lot of times is this concept of genocide. Okay, genocide is the annihilation or attempted annihilation of a people because of their presumed race or ethnicity. Okay. We're very familiar that genocide occurred during the Holocaust, but I think that what we don't realize is that we've had episodes of genocide in recent times. And I think that was something that always shocked me. During my first sociological course in college, during my undergrad, I was down at USF and I took this course referencing some of the political and social issues that were occurring contemporarily. One of which was recently happened in the summer of 94 was Rwanda. The Hutu slaughtered about 800,000 Tutsis, which you guys will actually get to see a partial video of that. And this was just absolutely atrocious. Most of the individuals were massacred with machetes. You began to see that the Serbs in Bosnia, and during that same decade as well, massacred Muslims. And so we began to hear the term ethnic cleansing, in a sense. And so we have seen that these recent killings are not necessarily accompanied by swastikas and gas ovens and that type of stuff. But the goal is all in all the same, right? So this idea of race is really important for us to begin to dispel. And so that we understand, yes, it's so embedded in our culture, but there's no race that's superior. And even for people to be classified into races at times can be just sort of offstanding. And so let's look at this a little bit more in more depth, okay? Again, so let's talk about ethnicity. We understand that there are shared cultural characteristics that exist within our society, right? By sharing a particular culture or nationality characteristic, that's important for us. Those distinctive cultural characteristics are what a lot of times are on the basis of a common ancestry, right? Maybe even your cultural heritage. There's a sense of belonging a lot of times that can occur with ethnicity. And so it can come from maybe a particular nation or region or distinctive foods, maybe your clothing, your language, your music, perhaps your religion, all those types of things. Maybe it's the family names and relationships, right? If you're Irish, you might know what Irish clan you were descended from, right? There are different parts of things that are so important to people, but that is somebody's ethnicity, right? So it's that shared collection of things, those unique cultural traits. Maybe it's holiday practice or religious practices that you do. Maybe it's even just having that sense of community, having both formal and informal things such as fraternal groups, churches, immigrant societies, that type of stuff. And so even just feeling like, I'm Irish or I'm Chinese or I'm African American or whatever the case is, or I'm German, right? Those are all part of somebody's ascribed membership that you've had from birth into something. And so we even have seen with ethnicity that there are things such as territorial pieces of it, right? Maybe you're from Little Italy or from Chinatown or Greek town or whatever the case is. So that's really important to individuals when we look at that. That's part of who they are and they identify with. And I think people a lot of times confuse the terms race and ethnic groups. So I really want to make sure that we're very clear on the two differences with that. And so that's something that you will need to know for that final exam, is for you guys to understand the difference between race as being those physical characteristics and ethnicity just being something of that shared culture or the nationality characteristics. Okay. Again, there is that image of Hitler and sort of understanding that was a huge part of our culture. So I think the question is, some people confuse, are Jews a race or are they an ethnic group? And so what we need to begin to decipher is that there are cultural characteristics like religion that bind certain people together. Many people, including some Jews, actually consider Jews a race. So Jews, however, are more properly considered an ethnic group since it's more that cultural characteristic, especially their religion, that sort of bind them together. So really interesting for us to look at. Jews in China may have Chinese features, while some Swedish Jews maybe have blue eyes and blonde, right? So that confusion and that very blurred line between race and ethnicity, I think is really important for us to begin to decipher and begin to dispel some of this stuff. So there's no such thing as a pure race. And I think biologists cannot even agree on how many races even exist today. Estimates range up to about 2,000, according to Ashley Montagu, who in 1964 had identified that there were 40 different races. Even one drop of blood can spoil racial purity in the Old South, is what they were indicating. But understand that up to today, right, we have probably about 2,000 races that exist within our society. Okay. So it's really hard to even pinpoint an actual number. That color line, though, has been so important, even from 1619 in the U.S., when we began to talk about slavery that was happening in Virginia and across the U.S., right? We saw that slavery sort of followed, and that culture with racism really took on a much larger element of things. And so we're going to begin to talk about that a little bit more. Sociologist Lewis Worth defined a minority group as people who are singled out for unequal treatment and who regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. Okay? So a dominant group is one that's sort of advantaged and has superior resources. Okay? And rights in a society. Maybe numerical minority, like the Boers, which we'll talk about in South Africa and stuff. But understand that minority group has some type of unequal treatment that occurs. The dominant group has some type of advantages and superior resources attached to them. Okay? And so minority, a lot of times, you're going to see that they share several conditions. Maybe it's their physical or cultural traits are held in maybe low esteem in that particular dominant group. So as a result, they're treated unfairly, and they tend to marry within their own group is the belief system. These conditions tend to create a sense of identity among minorities. Okay. So we had talked about that us versus them mentality or we mentality. And so we have a sense of common destiny a lot of times that begins to emerge within this. Lewis Worth, which I said, sort of defined that minority group as not necessarily a numerical minority, but defined by power. So not defined by population, but by power. Okay. So in California, for example, 54% of families do not speak English as their first language as of 2005. How interesting is that? 54% of families do not speak English as their first language. We see that minority groups are the result of geographic expansion. So when we look at some of these smaller tribes, there was only one culture. But once the tribe moved, right, and interacted with others, that ethnic conflicts began. And so we began to see this concept of dominant and inferior cultures and statuses that begin to emerge. Okay. You're going to start to see that that's sort of the root of why we begin to see political power issues and, dominant groups may be using that position to discriminate against others with differences and inferior traits in that sense, in their mindset. So that dominant group considers its privileged position to be the result of its own innate superiority. Okay. Now, how does a group even become a minority group? Your question might be, right? What's interesting is a group becomes a minority in one of two ways. The first is through the expansion of political boundaries, right? Think about it. With the exception of maybe females, tribal societies contain no minority groups. Everyone sort of shares that same culture, same language, and belongs to that same group. So when a group expands its political boundaries, it produces minority groups. So it begins to incorporate with people with different customs, different languages or values or physical characteristics within that, right? And so as a result of that, they can then start to see that other groups might have issues with them potentially moving into that particular area. So in 1848, after defeating Mexico in the war, the United States took over the Southwest. The Mexicans living there, who had been the dominant group at the time prior to the war, were transformed into a minority group. So a master status that had influenced their lives ever since. So one Latino even used the term within the book, we didn't move across the border moved across us. What an interesting way to look at how this is. You see how that sort of transcends from one area to another because of that geographical movement. And that expansion that can happen. And in this case, right, the United States moved the border at that time. And all of a sudden, those Mexicans that had lived at that area were now looked at as being the minority versus being the dominant group. It's very interesting when we look at this. Now, a second way in which a group can become a minority is by migration. This can be voluntarily, as with the Mexicans and South Americans who maybe have chosen to move to the United States, or involuntary, such as those Africans that were brought to the United States through slavery, right? And of course, the way females become a minority group represents a third way, but we'll discuss that. If you were to take a further sociological course, we eventually get that down the road. So understand that it can, two different ways that you can become a minority group, I guess I should say. One